One tenant advocate believes that rent control saves lives. I'm going to tell you exactly why he's wrong. I'm Tony, and this is Real Estate Investing and Landlord News. All right, so I have an interesting article for you today, and it's basically an argument against everything that I'm always talking about. I'm always talking about how awful rent control is for tenants, and the author of this article has the opposing viewpoint. They believe that rent control actually is helping things, making things better, and that it's going to lead to better outcomes for people overall, and in particular, lower homelessness and lower displacement. Now, I'm not going to say that, hey, rent control is a bad deal for the tenants who are lucky enough to get the units, right? What I am saying is that it hurts the market overall and has long term unintended consequences that have been proven time and time again, and that the author of this article is ignoring those facts. So I'm going to rip this article apart as I go through it because it's absolutely ridiculous in my mind. And it seems like this person has never studied actual results of rent control, has never actually looked at the results and seen what the consequence is, and instead they painted a picture in their head of what they think it is, and now they're going and spewing nonsense to everyone. So that's why I got to rip this apart. So before I get into the article, go ahead, hit the like and subscribe button, maybe leave a comment down below and let me know what you think. Do you think rent control saves lives? I mean, really, do you think that rent control is going to actually help people, stay out of homelessness? I actually think the opposite. I think it will push people into homelessness with unaffordable housing costs caused by rent control. But I'll explain that as I go through this article. So anyway, let's get into it. This article is coming from thehill.com, and it says, rent control saves lives. It's an opinion piece, of course. So, I'm curious what other people think of my opinions, and put in comments down below exactly what you think. For millions of American renters, these are troubling times. In fact, the times have never been more troubling, given that the typical renter in today's America is now classified as rent burdened, with 30% or more of their monthly income going toward housing alone. In a July letter to the Biden administration, 32 economists warned there is not a single state where a worker earning a full time minimum wage salary can afford a modest two-bedroom apartment. And, according to a University of San Francisco study also released this summer, more than 170,000 people in California, my home state, are without any home at all. And yeah, there are a lot of homeless people in California, but keep in mind, California is one of those few places that already has rent control in place. So if their rent control laws were actually helping people and helping prevent homelessness, why is the highest population of homelessness in the state with the rent control law? Okay, I mean that's pretty logical question right there, right? It doesn't make much sense, but it does make sense. Okay. The other issue is, they bring up the statistics about, well, somebody working full time at a minimum wage job couldn't afford somewhere to live. And you know what? The reality of the situation is that most people make far more than minimum wage. So, just for an example, here in Nebraska, right? I don't even know what our minimum wage is, right? But our unemployment rate is so low that employers have to offer much higher, dollars an hour more than the minimum wage in order to attract employees. And so the few jobs that are minimum wage are, usually part-time jobs, very low entry level jobs, and it's not the same thing, where the people who have those jobs, they are not dependent upon a single income. It might be somebody who's working part-time as a supplemental income to a spouse or partner who is full-time. Okay, so it this is very, very misleading, suggesting that, hey, I should be able to go out and I'm only making minimum wage. It doesn't take very long to get above a minimum wage. I remember being 16 years old in my very one of my very first jobs. I think I got my first job at 14, and my second job I was 16 years old, right? And at the time, the minimum wage in the state of Kansas was $4.25 an hour, and I was making at 16 $7 an hour. almost $3 an hour higher than the minimum wage at 16 years old. And I'm just giving a small example. This is a long time ago, of course, but that should go to tell you that, hey, employers, they have to be able to attract the employees, and most employees are not going to sit there and try to live off of a bare bones minimum wage job. We are in the midst of a dire humanitarian and public health crisis, and corporate landlords and real estate tycoons are spending their time and money demonizing rent control. According to Big Real Estate, the best solution to the problem is to build more luxury apartments than most people can afford. They would like you to believe that a rent control induced reduction in the overall supply of apartments drives up prices, and somehow expansion in the supply of $5,000 a month studios in the West Village is the real antidote to homelessness. And that's an idiotic argument right there. First of all, real estate investors and developers, we're not sitting here saying that, hey, we only want to build luxury apartments. The problem is within a place like New York, in particular in the West Village, which is one of the most expensive places in New York, if you don't build luxury apartments, then you will not be able to turn a profit. Okay. And if you're not able to turn a profit, you're not going to build. So you put these landlords, you put these real estate developers in a position where the only way they can turn a profit with the developments they build is by building luxury. So, what is the real solution? Is to make it so that landlords can build more affordable types of housing without all of the red tape, without all of the government regulations, without having to pay just tons and tons and tons of fees and money on top of the very expensive land, on top of the extremely expensive labor they need. And, I mean, it could add millions and millions of dollars to the cost of any project just having to deal with the government red tape. Okay. And that's what is driving the cost of housing up. Not only that, but a lot of governments, they just don't want people to build. They do everything possible to try to hold up projects, to try to prevent projects, and that's a bad thing. Instead, what they need to be doing is figuring out ways to make it more affordable and easier and faster for developers to build. And then maybe developers would have an incentive to build market rate affordable housing. Okay. Basically non-luxury housing. So middle class housing is what I'm trying to say there. Reality check. There is no legitimate evidence that rent control leads to a reduction in housing supply. Okay, and that's garbage right there. I read one sentence and they said there's no legitimate evidence that it leads to a reduction in housing supply. Well, yeah, there is plenty of legitimate evidence, okay? And that is led by the fact that places with rent control overall, right, have much, much, much lower building of new housing development, much lower than places without rent control. Now, that's not to say there's no development. Obviously, because of the exceptions they put in, some people, with enough money, they're able to figure out ways to develop, right? But what you don't see is people coming in there and they're building smaller projects, people going in there and building affordable projects because they have taken away all incentive to do so. In fact, what you do see is the number of rent controlled units within a city decline over time, okay? Thousands of units, they just disappear, they just go into the void. If rent control doesn't reduce the number of doesn't lead to a reduction in the housing supply, why are the number of rent control units in places like New York and San Francisco just constantly declining? I mean, they count the numbers. Those numbers aren't increasing. They're not staying the same either. They're only going down. Virtually all rent regulations, including new statewide laws, exempt new construction. Moreover, empirical studies in New Jersey and Washington, D.C. have found no relationship between rent control and new housing development, according to the nonpartisan Urban Institute. Even when rent control suppresses rent and property values, it has negligible effect on new construction. Lies, total and fake lies, okay? They made up these lies in order to further push rent control laws, right? And That I have a huge problem with that because you could talk to any real estate developer, including those who build units within cities with rent control, right? And they will tell you that, hey, rent control discourages development. Why? Because I don't want to build there. There are more landlords than you can count who will not build in any place with rent control. Okay, it's ridiculous that to even suggest that it doesn't have an impact on the decisions that developers and real estate investors make when deciding to build properties is it's foolish. It's foolish, it's dumb, and it's ignorant. And rather than talking to the people who actually build the properties, they're like, oh, we're going to do a study. And, like, well, maybe you should talk to the people who actually build the properties, the people who actually invest in your city. Like you go and talk to these people, right? And they'll be like, yeah, I would build 5 times as many properties in your city if it wasn't for these rent control laws. And that's the people who are still building. Okay. To suggest otherwise is nothing more than a distraction. Big real estate's talking points distract the overwhelming majority of Americans from recognizing the problem at hand and rallying behind a solution that actually works for them. This is no time for the real estate industry sloganeering. Not when corporate landlords gleefully spend their profits on luxury cars and super yachts, while the rest of us crumble under the financial burden of monthly rent. The real estate website Zillow found that in cities where the typical renter is overburdened, a spike in homelessness naturally follows and leads to an increase in unhoused individuals dying on the streets. So the author uses common tactic there, right? First of all, you want to paint landlords as these greedy tycoons sitting on yachts. What a joke, okay? That isn't even the reality for 99% of landlords. Maybe the very top 1% are doing that well, right? But even big landlords, most of them are much more normal than you'd ever imagine, okay? They're not, greedy tycoons just trying to sit there and leech people dry. That's stupid. That's just stupid. And I hate reading about this sort of nonsense, right? The second thing they try to do is they make the implication that somehow rent control is going to somehow prevent homelessness. And as I've explained many, many times before, rent control actually will drive more people into homelessness. And that's exactly what we're seeing in California because it constrains the development of new housing. Okay. It makes it so that developers don't want to build there. People don't want to rent their units out. People will convert existing units into other uses, be it they sell them to owner occupants, by turning them into condos or co-ops, or they just leave their units empty. Okay, they have articles in the newspaper talking about how rent control landlords are leaving. They're warehousing their units up in New York City because it's more expensive for them to repair them than it is to rent them out. So, but the author is ignoring this. The author of this article is, they seem to think that somehow rent control is going to keep people from being homeless, right? When instead, what we have a situation where people who shouldn't be homeless, people who have a job, people who should be able to afford housing, they can't. They can't find any housing because there is no new development because the people who live in these rent control units never leave them. They just hold on to them for their entire lifetime, and then they pass them on to their children. And that is why it doesn't help the homelessness issue. It doesn't. Okay. So this is a joke. This article is a joke. I'm not even going to finish reading it. You can read the rest of it. I'll put the link to the article in the description below if you're interested. But more nonsense by some far left leaning lunatic who doesn't even look at the facts.